Well, while we're just sorting out, I think my presentation is not on this desktop, but it'll come in a minute. So while we're waiting for that, let me just say how happy I am to be here. It's always, I think, the most invaluable part of any conference like this is actually the young people who come. And I have found over the years that I've learned much more from the younger participants. So I'm really looking forward to this workshop, and I hope you all will enjoy it. It looks like a really exciting program overall. So I think I'd like to commend the organizers for making something so interesting. Now, the reason I'm going to talk about China and India is not just because of the obvious reason that I'm from India, but because I actually feel that there is so much misrepresentation of what is going on in these two countries. Okay, because there's just so much misrepresentation of what is going on in China and India. It's often, first of all, they're treated as similar, which, as I hope to show you, is completely wrong. And it's true, they're similar in many ways. We are both very large populations, and in fact, soon India's population will be more than China. We have increasingly increased shares in the global economy, but really the role of China is dramatically larger, more significant, in many ways superior to that of India. India is still really a very small player in the global network. But more than that, the presumption is that, in a way, these are economies that have benefited from globalization while the rest of the world has kind of sunk from globalization. And it's very widespread also in Europe, this notion that the jobs are being taken away, in a way, by China and India, in a sense that the pattern of globalization is such that you have more and more of the production shifting for sure, but also, therefore, the employment shifting. To a significant extent, that has been true of China. It has not been true of India. It's not been true of most of the developing world. And in the last 10 years, it's not true of China either, which I will hope to show you in a minute. But there are a bunch of these misconceptions, which I think are quite significant. Finally, I think the important thing to note is that the macroeconomics of the two are completely different, because despite all the liberalization, market orientation, and everything in China, it is still heavily state-dominated as an economic system, not just as a political system. And that's significant because it means that the, shall we say, the sort of standard dynamics that all of you know as neo-Keynesians or post-Keynesians in terms of demand being an issue and so on, are much less evident because they can be much more affected by state intervention. Whereas India is, if you like, your classic mixed developing economy where we have all these standard patterns of problems of lack of effective demand, of income inequality generating stagnationary impulses, which then translate into debt-driven bubbles that provide periods of growth that ultimately end in tears and so on. So in a sense, the macroeconomics of the two also very, very dramatically different. And I think that provides lessons for understanding the rest of the developing world as well. I think, the whole presumption that there are these two giants emerging, one of them is not a giant for sure, is flawed. But more than that, the implications for global stagflation, I'm calling it, because in the developing world that's what it's becoming, not just stagnation. Here you're much more used to deflation, but in the developing world it's much more a stagflationary impulse. I think those impulses are increasingly evident in both our economies, in both China and India. So that's the reason why I wanted to talk about these two economies. Now, I'd like to start, but I need a little bit of, I wanted to show you a couple of slides. So it's just an email, darling. Can't we just download it here? Oh, I see, okay. I could have just brought it with me if I'd known, I'm sorry. Okay. Okay. Well, let's first just look, I was going to show you some of the graphs, but it doesn't really matter. because take my word for it, okay? Okay, let's begin with China, because, you know, obviously it's where everybody begins now, right? And it's an absolutely remarkable growth miracle, okay? We have income increasing by 33 times between 1978 and 2016. Now, that's historically unprecedented. And that's, I mean, real incomes increasing by 33 times, very, very dramatic sort of increase. And everybody attributes this to opening up, okay? That, you know, there was this slumbering giant, and it was closed economy and planning and all of that. Then they opened up, and then, wow, look at them. Now they have this 33 times increase in income. Rates of growth between 6 to 15% per year. That's the kind of range we're talking about. The low growth was 6%, okay? But what people tend to forget is that this was actually critically dependent on the kind of economy that existed in the past. In other words, you cannot get that, I mean, opening on its own in most other developing countries has not generated this kind of growth. So what was it in China that enabled this? I would argue there are a number of factors. First is the fact that the revolution, the subsequent land reform, and a whole range of state policies had actually generated a relatively equal society and an equal economy, okay? That's important because it means that relatively small changes in relative prices are spread over a much larger population, particularly in agriculture. You know, this whole thing about poverty reduction in China that everyone talks about, when you look at it, the big changes in poverty reduction happen in two periods, in the period 78 to 81, and in the period 94 to 96. Why is that? Because these are the two periods when they dramatically change the terms of trade away from agriculture, from industry to agriculture. In other words, they increase the relative farm incomes. Now, doing that in China had a huge impact on poverty, not just because most of the population was agricultural, but because, in fact, that agricultural population was relatively equal. And it benefited a vast range across the population. And so all small farmers benefited, and everybody was a small farmer, right? Whether in a cooperative or otherwise, all small farmers benefited. Now, if you did a similar thing in India, you would not get poverty reduction of that kind because it's a much more unequal agrarian economy where you have a significant number of net buyers of agricultural produce. You have landless workers and others. You also have very small and marginal peasantry who are net buyers. And you actually don't necessarily get an improvement across the board. In fact, if you did a similar step in India, you would get a rise in inequality and not much decline in poverty. Okay, so I've said all this already. If you want to have a quick look, but I've said it all. So shall we move on? Yeah? Okay. So the institutional conditions, which also I've said, but I want to spend a little bit of time on because, you know, people forget this. People forget about the very, very significant institutional conditions. And it's usually seen that, oh, there's these huge mass populations with lots of poor people and lots of surplus labor and so on. But these were absolutely critical. India, fundamentally, your typical less developed capitalist economy. Mixed, yes, but actually less mixed than most of Europe, okay? Less state control, even in its so-called Nehruvian planning phase, than most of Europe today, including France and Germany. So with that, we also have involuntary unemployment. We also have all of these typical tendencies. China, until recently, a command economy with a very small private sector. Now it's the other way. Now the private sector is actually larger in terms of both investment and employment. And share of economic activity, it's not really very clear. But in fact, there's very substantial state control over macroeconomic processes. So it's not a conventional capitalist economy. And you have to bear that in mind when you're looking at the impact of macro policies. Fiscal policy, for example, is much less significant. It has a relatively low share of public investment to GDP or fiscal deficit to GDP, but that's because it has other levers for state control. The political part is kind of evident. Everybody knows that. As I said, very, very dramatic rates of growth for 3 decades in China. In India, we've had slightly higher progressive rates over the last 3 decades, between 5.6, then 8 to 9. Now it's around 7%. The data are flawed, so I say 7% with some hesitation, but we can get into discussions about whether, the data on India, the GDP data, are valid. They haven't been valid in China for a while either. So, but the significant difference, of course, is the investment rate. You have historically unprecedented investment rates in China, between 35 to 45% of GDP, in 1 year, even 46% of GDP. Historically unprecedented. There are only 2 economies that I found in the 20th century that had it. It was the Soviet Union under Stalin for only a period of 12 years, and Indonesia under Suharto for only a period of 7 years. So 3 decades of this kind of investment rate. It's also a high domestic savings rate. It implies an ability to actually suppress domestic demand relative to income, domestic consumption relative to income, which either requires a very strong social contract or an authoritarian regime. In India, much lower investment rates, which have now been falling. Investment rates in India have been, despite this whole thing that we are this big success story over the last 5 years, investment rates have been falling from 34% around 2012 to about 29% today. The big difference, and this is evident to any of you who will travel to either China or India, is in infrastructure investment. Around 1/5 of GDP in China has been spent on just infrastructure investment over these 30 years. And in India, around 2%. This is evident the minute you go. Everything in China is new and gleaming and shiny and wonderful, and the roads are amazing and the ports are amazing, and there are new buildings coming up every time you look. And in India, everything is clogged, the infrastructure is creaking, it's inadequate, and so on. Okay, so that's sort of immediately evident. Okay, now this is the share of world GDP of China and India. And if you can look at the red line, that's China. Now, remember, this is not in purchasing power parity terms. This is in market exchange rates. And there's a reason for that, which I will come to in a minute. But even so, it's significant. It went up to about nearly 10%. And I think now this goes up only till 2014. It's now about 12%. India really still very, very small. It's only 2%. But the interesting thing, if you want to look at the yellow bars are the ratio of Chinese per capita GDP to India's. And even in 1960, China was significantly lower than India in terms of per capita GDP at market exchange rates. Okay? It really equalizes in the mid-80s and subsequently increases dramatically to the point where now it's 3.5 times. Okay? So that's the big story there. I mentioned that I have chosen market exchange rates rather than per capita, or PPP, sorry, purchasing power parity exchange rates, and there's a reason. As you can see, the dark line here, the black line, is the PPP exchange rate per capita GDP for China and India. The green line is in terms of constant US dollars, $2005. Why is there such a difference? As you can see, if you look only at the market exchange rate, you get a much lower increase in per capita GDP. The PPP thing shoots up dramatically. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the method of evaluating the PPP exchange rates. The basic idea is that the PPP exchange rate calculates the purchasing power of your currency on the basis of a certain basket of goods and services, which is calculated through survey. Yeah? And this was originally developed by Alan Heston and both Alan, yeah, Heston and Summers, and subsequently the World Bank took it up. This is now the basis for all international comparisons. The World Bank does it, COP15 does it, WTO does it. Everyone's using PPP exchange rates to look at relative incomes. I argue that this is completely flawed. It's wrong to actually do this. Why? Why is the PPP exchange rate for India so much higher than the market exchange rate. To give you an example, the market exchange rate of India, the Indian rupee for the euro is about 70 euro. Okay, sorry, 70 rupees per euro. Okay, 1 euro equals 70 rupees. The PPP exchange rate is 1 euro equals maybe 11 or 12 rupees. Significantly higher exchange rate. Now, why is that? Because you can buy a lot more for 70 rupees in India than you can buy with 1 euro, right? Obvious. Why can you buy a lot more? Because there are people supplying goods and services very, very cheaply. How are they doing this? Because they have very low wages. Okay? So what you're doing is you're saying that because of the fact that there is a very, very low wage economy, that is allowing people to actually access goods and services more cheaply. That in turn becomes a bit of an advantage for that economy. I don't know if you're, it's a circular argument. You're basically saying because you're poor and therefore you have low wages and therefore you're providing goods and services cheaply, but hey, that's an advantage. Just think you can buy these goods and services so cheaply. It's a bit like when you calculate, let's say, unpaid labor in a poor household and say, oh, you're actually much richer than you think because your wife is doing all this free labor for you. It's exactly the same at an international level. Now, what this has meant is twofold. There are all kinds of other methodological problems with the calculation. I'm not going to bore you with those. We can have a discussion on that because, by the way, it's very important. Everyone uses this all the time, and it's a disaster. Okay? But the important implications, one is that a whole bunch of developing countries are presented as having much higher incomes. And second is that the change, the variation has increased dramatically over time, as you can see. The PPP income has been moving up much more sharply than the market exchange rate income. Okay? A lot of that has to do with measurement. Nobody actually did a survey in India in China until 2005. And when they did, they suddenly discovered that prices are higher than they expected. So they had to bring down the PPP exchange rate by 20%. More recently, they've done other surveys, and it depends a lot where you do the survey. Do you do it in the malls? Do you do it in the markets? Where do you define your prices? Which will give you a dramatic change in the exchange rate. But as we can see, this has given, I would argue, a completely wrong representation of the actual movement. Final point about the PPP is that, listen, it would be fine if actually international trade, investment, capital flows, etc., also happened at PPP exchange rates. Unfortunately, they don't. We are talking about economies where trade is 50, 60% of GDP, where capital flows account often for between 10 to 15% of GDP, all of which take place at market exchange rates. So to actually say, well, really you're richer than that is, I would argue, deeply misleading. Okay? All right. Just in terms of the trade patterns, we all know the China story, rapid export growth, aggressive increases in world market shares, and it's essentially relocative capital, which was driven, of course, by cheap labor, but actually the cheap labor is the lesser part of it. It was heavily subsidized infrastructure expansion. It was that 20% of investment, of GDP investment in infrastructure that really drove this. As a result, China becomes a crucial source of raw material and intermediate imports for the rest of the developing world. In other words, the flying geese story did work in that case. China became the lead goose, driving up exports of particularly primary commodities and intermediate goods from almost every other developing region. Why almost every other developing region? China is now the largest trading partner for most of the economies of the world. In India, we had a much lower rate of export growth. Yes, we had cheap labor. In fact, our labor is much cheaper. Average wages are 1/5 of those in China at the moment. But it's low absolute wages. And the absence of infrastructure, the poor public provision of health, education, etc., all have meant that doesn't translate into low unit wage costs. Okay? Because obviously workers are only as efficient as the material they're given to work with and the instruments they're given to work with. And therefore, productivity rates are much lower in India. So exports not yet an engine of growth. Everyone talks about services being this huge source of Indian export growth. China is the factory of the world, India is the office of the world, is what used to be said. This is much, much more limited. And in fact, that particular phase is almost over. It is likely in the next few years that India will become a net importer of software services, because we have killed our hardware industry. And as you know, so much software now comes embedded in the hardware, whether it's in your mobile phones or your tablets or your laptops. And therefore, that particular phase is also, unfortunately, grinding to a halt. Okay, significance in world trade. The big story, once again, is China. The first set of bars is the USA, the second is China, and the third is India, just to give you a sense of where we're at. And as you can see, exports, absolutely, China's role increases dramatically, so that it's 12, 13% of global exports, significantly higher than the US. But what is more interesting and more important in some ways for this whole flying geese thing that I was talking about is the fact that its share of world imports has also increased very sharply. And it's edging up to the US. The US used to be the driver of global demand. That role reduced significantly. In fact, in the most recent data, you would find it's even lower. And China's has increased quite substantially. And it's really that which has been driving a lot of the rest of the developing country expansion. And as you can see, India remains insignificant. Our share of imports is much higher than exports, but nonetheless, really very, very low. The big difference also, the institutional conditions that I was talking about, the big difference is the financial sector. Now, in India, the financial sector, again, typical mixed economy, not really government control. Everyone talks about how we have nationalized banks, and it's true, about 60% of the banking system is under state control. But increasingly, it's until the 2000s, they were really told, in the period of liberalization, they were told to behave like private sector banks, go for the profit, go for the bottom line, don't necessarily do social objectives. And subsequently, because we killed our development banking system, our public sector commercial banks were made to behave like development banks. They were made to invest in heavy industries, infrastructure, long gestation period things that commercial banks are not supposed to invest in. And so now they're all stuck with lots of non-performing assets. But basically, there is a period of financial liberalization from 1993 onwards, which has meant a significant loss of control over the financial system. I don't need to tell you in Europe about it. You know what that means. In China, despite all the liberalization, I would put the last 2 or 3 years a bit differently, but despite a lot of the liberalization, the bulk of the financial sector is still under the control of the state. 4 major publicly owned banks account for still about 80% of transactions, even after the rise of shadow banking. And you can use credit to regulate the economic cycle. That's really what they have been doing. It's not that they use fiscal policy to regulate the economic cycle. They use the allocation of credit. When they feel the economy is overheating, you reduce credit. When you want it to go up again, you increase credit. So it's very strongly driven by the state's intervention in finance. It's changing now. It's changing at the margin, and that margin, I argue, is one of the sources of fragility of the Chinese economy, but we come to that. Now, the structural change. China had, if you like, the classic pattern, you know, the Lewis Kuznets kind of pattern, where you move from primary to secondary to tertiary. And the manufacturing sector doubled its share of workforce, tripled its share of output. It's now at 40% of output, 45% of output, and about 28% of the workforce. In India, we didn't have that. We didn't have this basic structural transformation. The move has really been from agriculture to services in output. So I don't know if I have the data here. Yes, I do. Okay. Here, this is, if you like, classic. This is South Korea, Kuznets-style, perfect textbook case of what structural change is all about. And as you can see, this is the growth rate of GDP. This is the share of agriculture in output, in national income. No, sorry, I'm sorry. This is the share of agriculture in national income, goes from about 33% to less than 10%. Okay? This is the share of agriculture in the workforce, going from about 64% to 10%. That's exactly what you want to happen if you're also getting this thing going on in manufacturing. Manufacturing share of output keeps increasing to a very healthy 42%. Manufacturing share of employment increases up to a point until the early 90s, and then decreases because manufacturing becomes more and more productive. Okay? That gap is then taken by services. This is what's supposed to happen. This is what happened in Europe. This is what happened in Germany in the 19th century and early 20th century. This is what happens in Korea in the late 20th century. And this is what is happening in China. It's in the process. It hasn't finished, but this is the process that is going on. And as you can see, the share of agriculture in output coming down, the share of agriculture in the workforce coming down. The share of manufacturing was very strong even at the beginning of this period because of the Soviet-style industrialization, if you like, but it has remained very high and even increased slightly. The share of the, this is total industry, manufacturing plus construction and so on. And this is the share of manufacturing in employment, which has also increased over this period. So it's in the Kuznets path, if you like. India, on the other hand, is nowhere near the Kuznets path. And that's surprising because this is the period of rapid GDP growth, as you can see. This is the period when, India emerges on the world stage and everybody starts looking up and noticing and all of that. This is also the period when it sheds all of its dirigist, Nehruvian, mixed economy notions and becomes pure, good old, neoliberal capitalist style. Nonetheless, GDP grows. The share of agriculture in national income falls. The share of the primary sector in national income remains almost constant. That's the really bad story, which is made even worse by the fact that manufacturing barely budges as a share of both output and employment. And I would argue that a lot of the problems of India, including the terrible human development indicators and everything, come from this basic inability to do the structural transformation. We didn't do the basic change, and we didn't do it over 65 years, nearly 70 years of independence. So that's, if you like, the backstory for understanding anything that happens today. And as I said, it affects both poverty reduction and human development. In China, poverty almost eliminated. By the way, China, I don't know how many of you know this, is the real reason why the MDGs were achieved. Okay? If you take China out, the MDGs are not really achieved. China never adopted the MDGs. It never officially adopted the Millennium Development Goals. On the other hand, its growth strategy and so on was such that it ended up overachieving. And that has actually allowed the global community to say that the MDGs were very successful. But as I said, officially only 4% are now under the poverty line. Unofficially, people say, okay, maybe 12%. But it's the fact of earlier asset distribution, the basic needs provision, which all generated a larger mass market. And as I mentioned, this role of agricultural prices, which has a dramatic impact in poverty reduction. And of course, in the early phases, there was a universal extension of health and education. It's true that it was regionally not as successful. It didn't really, get to all the regions, but nonetheless, there was an attempt at universal. In the 90s, there was an attempt at privatizing a lot of these or reducing the public provision, which in turn meant worse indicators, including a lot of girls drop out from school and so on. Since the early 2000s, there has been a significant revival in both of these. And in 2009, as part of the recovery package after the crisis, there was a significant increase in public health expenditure, which has also improved their overall human development indicators. In India, our official poverty ratio is much higher. Currently, well, at 28%, but now it's 24% because we changed the definition. So we have 24% poverty under a slightly different definition of poverty, which is not comparable with our earlier ones. Food deprivation is much higher. There are states in India where food deprivation is worse than the average of sub-Saharan Africa. And our outcome indicators, women's BMI and the food outcome indicators typically are at the bottom of most international comparisons. And of course, public provision of essential services is extremely inadequate. The central government spends only 1% of GDP on health. So the health expenditure is dominantly the burden of private families. And education spending, there was a little bit of increase. It's well below China, and it's declining once again. But despite all these differences, in fact, you find that both economies now face broadly similar problems. And the first one is that both of us desperately need a change in the growth strategy. China's recent growth strategy was essentially a high accumulation-based, export market-oriented drive, okay? So, come on, 45% of GDP investment, if you don't grow at 8 to 10%, there's something wrong with you, right? If you're spending half of your GDP on investment, you should be growing even faster, given some ICOR. And it now has to shift from that to one that is much more based on domestic demand through rising wage incomes. So far, it hasn't really tried that, only to a limited extent. So far, it has been based much more on shifting from external demand to domestic demand based on debt. Now, once again, you all know what that means. I don't have to belabor the point that shifting to a debt-based strategy is very different from shifting to a rising wage income-based strategy. One is a more sustainable one that delivers demand over time. The other one generates a cycle which eventually ends in tears. In India, people say, service-led growth. Just to give you an idea, I told you already about software and IT sector no longer being a huge source of expansion. But just to give you a sense of the problem, total employment in all ICT sectors, that is software, hardware, IT-based services, outsourcing, business process, all of that stuff taken together is less than 4 million, okay? Our workforce is 580 million. So it's not even 1% of our workforce. The idea that that can actually, create a leapfrogging of the whole economy and employ enough of our people is laughable. So it's really, we cannot rely on that to actually solve either the employment problem or the absence of structural change. Inequality in both economies rising significantly in the recent past, both horizontal, regional, and the vertical ones. Employment is a huge challenge for India, everybody knows that. But by the way, even in China, it's no longer the case that employment is not a concern. Jobs are available, but increasingly more fragile, more insecure. The big increase in jobs is in services, but not in the desirable services necessarily. In the recent past, most of the big increase in service jobs has been in things like delivery boys, actually, mostly, for large companies that deliver, the Chinese equivalent of the Amazons, and the increase in relatively poorly paid service work for women in urban areas. And this simply does not meet the aspirations of the young population in China. Then there's the issue of environmental sustainability of this growth, which I will come back to. But both India and China face similar problems. It's shocking that we face similar problems because, as I told you, India is at a much lower level of development. So at least we should be facing smaller problems on environment. But no, hey, ours are bigger now. Okay. China, let's look at it a little bit now. Recent rebalancing is happening to some extent. Okay, you look at investment rates, they really were very, very high, but they have been coming down, as you can see. That's this bit here. And the growth rate also has been coming down. It's still interesting, though, that very, very high, relatively very high rates of investment growth, still 45%, are generating only 7% rate of growth of income. It's, in a macroeconomic sense, it means that a lot of this investment is not necessarily growing into very productive kinds of activities. But more than that, there is the concern. Okay, let's just finish off with this internal and external rebalancing. So the investment to GDP is coming down. That's internal rebalancing that everybody has saying China must do, must move away from investment-led to consumption-led. So a little bit that's happening. Look at the current account balance. It fell quite sharply, no question about it, despite Donald Trump complaining about the trade deficit with the US. The aggregate current account balance fell very sharply till about 2013, but has since been recovering. In other words, the current account balance is now rising once again. Why is it rising? Essentially because imports are growing slower than exports, but I'll come back to that. Okay, this is another sign of the rebalancing, which is, I'm sorry that the series are not complete, so you don't get a proper sense, but let's begin by looking at household consumption, which is the blue dotted line. Can you see? It goes dramatically down from the mid-1990s to the late 2000s, okay? This is a very sharp decline in the share of household consumption in GDP associated with that rising investment rate. But it is rising thereafter. Still hasn't reached the levels of even the early 90s, but it is rising. So yes, there's some rebalancing. If you look at the wages, the wage rate falls, the wage shares of national income fall, subsequently rising once again. As you can see, these dotted lines here. I'm sorry the series are not complete. And profits rose very, very sharply, the counterpart of the wages falling, and have been much lower since. Okay, so yes, rebalancing internally is definitely ongoing. So many people have argued that in fact China has reached a Lewis turning point. You all know what that is, right? When you can no longer keep increasing growth without increasing wages. You have finished on your unlimited labor supply. Yeah, the whole Lewis model was based on the fact that you can keep drawing labor from what he saw as the rural, but the traditional sector, into the modern sector, and you don't have to pay higher wages because there's all this surplus labor lying about. And when you reach a turning point, you don't have that surplus labor anymore. You have to offer higher wages. And to some extent, yes, it's true that there has been this increase in wages, and as you can see, it's rising for all sectors. It's rising for the state, that's the highest column. It's rising for private and individual enterprises. And it's even rising for migrant workers. Now that's, if you like, the kind of critical point about the Lewis turning point, if it's rising even for migrant workers, okay? However, the rise in the migrant workers is significantly lower than it is for the state-owned enterprises, which have the highest wages. As you can see, the ratio is actually declining in the recent past. But of course, much more of urban employment in China is now private and individual. As you can see, the left side chart is showing you the state and private employment, and the private is the one that is booming, okay? And this is also true of manufacturing. Much more of it is private and individual. So that's a really big change in China. It's moved away from state-owned enterprises to large factories, sometimes run by MNCs, large factories and medium-sized factories, sometimes run by domestic capital and the TVEs, the town and village enterprises, and individual small-scale subcontractors. That is a very rising share even in China. But the other point is that you see really what happened in China, especially after the global crisis, is that they embarked on a recovery package that essentially implied a big increase in debt. So as you can see, since 2008, 2009, there's been a dramatic increase in debt for every sector of the economy, for the government, for corporations, for households, for financial institutions, to the point where, I mean, the estimates vary. The most recent estimate that the Bank for International Settlements has brought out is 272% of GDP, but different people have different measures also because there's a lot of shadow banking activity which doesn't allow you to really count the extent of the debt. However, even with the debt that we know about, we realize that just like you need more and more investment to generate the same level of GDP, or the same increase in GDP, you also need more and more credit or debt to generate the same increase in GDP. So the average credit intensity pre-crisis was just above 1. you need 1 unit of credit for 1 unit of GDP. Now it's closer to 3. It's a very significant increase in the credit intensity. You're giving out more and more debt to generate similar increases in income. And of course, as we know, income inequalities are still a big concern. The Gini has been rising. It fell a little bit, but it's still risen quite high. And fiscal redistribution really doesn't seem to do much. It doesn't change the Gini very dramatically at all. Okay, now let's look at India. Our GDP growth is slower than before. It's been coming down. The most recent data tell us that it's now 5.7%, which I will argue is an overestimate because various things have happened in the Indian economy that are not actually captured in the data of the previous year. But still, we're among the highest in the world. If you read the Indian newspapers, there's constantly a lot of attention. Are we faster than China? Are they faster than us? And, you know, one year we are 6.7 and they're 6.5, and everybody celebrates as if that means anything at all. But there is this whole obsession about how India is still one of the fastest growing countries in the world. But as I said, there is a significant slowdown. And this slowdown is actually greater than is suggested by these figures. Because the way we collect our quick estimates of GDP, we look at only the formal sector. And the formal sector is around half, maybe slightly more than half of GDP. We don't know. We get data on the informal sector only much later, after a lag of about 2 or 3 years. And we know that 2 things in particular have really affected informal activity. One is a drastic demonetization that happened a year ago. We just celebrated the anniversary of that last year, celebrated or mourned the anniversary of that last year. Many people in the world didn't notice because something else was happening in Washington at that same evening, actually. But that had a dramatic impact on informal activity. It really squeezed liquidity out of the system and completely decimated domestic demand, because 86% of the currency of the country was simply removed from circulation in a country where 96% of transactions happened in cash. And so suddenly this abrupt loss of liquidity, it's a bit like just, you know, a blood transfusion. You're just sucking the lifeblood out of a system and then saying, now grow. So there was a dramatic impact. That has still not gone. That had negative multiplier effects that persist to this day. And this is combined with a very complicated new system of GST, goods and services tax, a unified system of value-added tax, which is a problem in a federal country, but it's been made worse by the fact that instead of having 1 tax, we have 8 tax rates. And they're constantly changing and nobody knows. And, you know, tiny informal enterprises, people who are selling vegetables on the street are forced to submit, you know, 3 returns a month and 7 returns a year and all kinds of crazy things. So that's another blow to the informal sector. What is even more challenging is that in the recent past, most of the growth, this is the 5-year growth average, most of the growth has come from basically 2 things. More than 40% has come from just these 2 sectors. FIRE, that's finance, insurance, and real estate. And we all know the growth there is largely not mythical, but, you know, problematic, shall we say, okay? And public administration and defense. So, you know, this much vaunted 6.7 that we're all celebrating, nearly half of it comes from these 2, from government consumption and from FIRE, which is essentially a bubble economy. If you went blindfold into an economy like this, you would say, oh boy, this is a bubble, this is going to burst soon. So clearly it's a cause for concern. You know, investment, as I told you already, has fallen to 29% from 34% just 5 years ago. And growth is based on government consumption and FIRE. Agriculture grew well because we had good monsoons last year after ages of really bad monsoons, 4 years of bad monsoons. We had a really good monsoon. But because of demonetization, there was this collapse in effective demand. Prices did not go up, prices crashed, and farmers, in fact, across India are today protesting. Despite the rise in output, the output growth was in the range of 8%. The growth in value added in agriculture was 1%. So that's the kind of collapse in prices that we have seen. Big problem in India. if you had to ask me what's the single biggest problem, it's employment. We're simply not generating good quality jobs. I don't know if I have given you the data. Yes. Total employment, and remember, this is when GDP is growing at 7 to 10%. Total employment has stagnated. I think we are unique among most large economies, certainly G20, in that we do not have regular employment data. Our latest data, believe it or not, is 2011-12. Yeah, I know. It's the latest large survey. They just done another large survey. We hope to get the results. But the rumor is that no one's going to release the results till after the 2019 general elections. So I'm sorry, I have to give you these data because that's all we have. But please note, even in this period of rapid growth, employment didn't grow. Okay? Urban employment rose slightly, rural employment fell. Okay? Now, I have to tell you also that we have a very generous definition of employment at one level, which is to say that we have lots of different measures, but for example, if in the rural area, you don't really have a job, you don't really have much work to do on the family farm, but every day you go out and milk the cows, then you are regularly employed in our data. You are an employed person, regularly employed on a family enterprise. In the urban areas, you don't have a job, you don't have anything, you go and wash cars in the morning. You are regularly employed, self-employed, regularly employed in the service sector. So we are very generous in our definition of employment. Even so, it doesn't increase, it falls. How come it falls? Well, a large part of that, okay, let me first finish on the organized sector. And I remember Lewis, he says, or Kuznets, or everybody, they say not only will you shift from agriculture to manufacturing and then services, you will shift from informal to formal, right? Employment, workers will move to more and more formal contracts, larger enterprises, formal contracts, and so on. This has happened in Europe. That's why you're all used to what happens. Look at us. Organized employment has barely budged. This is the absolute numbers. And this is the period of most rapid growth when everybody was celebrating India. And that's because the private sector has increased slightly, maybe by 4 million, which is really nothing, considering. But the public sector has actually fallen. Okay? So really, organized employment, which includes workers with informal contracts, has barely budged. But even with that, wage shares have fallen. Now, you all know about falling wage shares, right? Productivity rises, wages don't go up, wage shares falling. We are like everybody else. Our wage shares have also fallen, but they've fallen pretty low, huh? At one point, they were 10% of manufacturing value added. Now we've managed to get ourselves back up to 14%, which is, if you're shouting about 30% wage shares in Europe, you realize what we're dealing with here in India. And, of course, informal employment dominates. Now, this, I'm sorry, you know, it's, what are the warnings they give that the following images may be whatever, something, unpleasant, distasteful, don't show your children, and so on. It's like this. We have a very, again, a very generous definition of what formal employment is, okay? To be called a formal worker, you have to have only one of three things. Not all three, just one. Either a written contract or any kind of social security, any kind, pensions, health insurance, anything, or paid leave. All you need is just one of these and you get called a formal worker. Even with that, a quarter of the workers in the organized public sector and more than half of the workers in the organized private sector were not formal, didn't have any of these. That is, they were on contract, they were casual, they were daily wage, whatever, okay? The total informal workers in the economy is 96% of the workforce. 96%, okay? So workers like me, I work in a public university, I have a regular job and everything. I'm one of 4% of the workforce. And it's true that, you know, the Indians you meet all work in formal jobs because it's a large economy. Hey, yeah, there are a lot of us. Even 4% is many millions. So, organized manufacturing, less than 14 million, okay? IT services, I told you already, around 3 million. Recognized workforce, above 500 million. So we are really talking about a hugely informal workforce. And as I told you, the informality has increased sharply in the public, declined slightly in the private, but that's because it was already very high. At 60%, has gone down to 44%. Okay? More than half the workers are informal in the organized public sector. When I say organized, I mean multinational companies, big software companies, everybody included. Nonetheless, even though informal activity dominates in terms of the workers, it gets less and less of the share of national income. Once again, we have only old data. I'm sorry about that, but they haven't released more recent data. But as you can see, it was falling even till the late 2000s. It must have fallen much more because of all the measures that I mentioned earlier. So basically, what's happening, we are trying to formalize the economy by killing off the informal sector. I mean, that's one way of doing it. It's a kind of neutron bomb approach to the problems, right? If you kill off the informal sector, you hope that the rest of the economy will be formal. Yes, but then where are the informal workers to go? What are the activities that they'll have to do? And that is where the problem is, okay? So I already mentioned the problems in agriculture. I think I mentioned demonetization and the attempt to force digital transactions onto people in a period where you don't have connectivity, you don't have universal banking access, you really can't force everyone to go digital. And the GST. Okay, I said 5 different rates, but they keep revising it. The GST, now it's 8 different rates. And multiple forms, a big addition to accounting costs. And basically, it really means that tiny informal services, manufacturing, everybody cannot compete anymore with these large-scale enterprises that will take over because the small ones are simply becoming unviable. Okay, I don't want to talk too long because we should have a discussion. I just want to quickly make this point because it's often ignored in a lot of the discussion, which is that, people ignore the gender element in an accumulation process, but it's very, very significant, and I think India shows it in a classic way, okay? What are the roles that gender plays? I'm sure some of you know this already. It allows you to subsidize capitalist production. Essentially, it ensures a social reproduction of labor because of unpaid activities. Gender concerns allow you to get a very flexible labor force. You can use the life cycle as a means of entry and exit. So you get young unmarried women, when they marry, they can go off, or when they have children, they go off and you get their younger sisters. It's a classic strategy, especially in East and Southeast Asia. Segmented labor markets. Women typically have lower reservation wages. They're willing to work for less. So very easy to actually use them for a higher extraction of surplus. And of course, the fact is that it's also very useful in periods of cyclical distress. It's a social cushion that helps families and communities. And all of you who are familiar with what's happening in the Eurozone periphery know the significance of that social cushion in dealing with the fallout of austerity. But again, here is something very interesting, common to China and India. In China, female labor force participation is declining quite significantly in this period of rapid growth. Isn't that striking? It was a high labor force. It was very high. It was about 74%, but now it's down to 63%, okay? But in India, we had really low labor force participation, and even that is declining, okay? Now, this is the male rate at about 55%, which is also kind of low. But the female rate was only 30%, and it's fallen to 24%, which is unbelievable. I have scoured all the data I could look at to find any other example of an economy that is growing dramatically over 3 decades where female labor force participation has declined to that extent. And I have not found. We are unique. Not in a good way, but we are. Most of this decline has happened in the rural areas, in agriculture, here. But that's because the urban rate was already so low. It was 15%. How can you go below 15%, right? So the decline has happened in the rural areas, but the overall rate is unbelievably low, and it doesn't increase despite the growth. Now, what's going on? In both countries, essentially, there's a shift from paid to unpaid. In China, it's a focus on, social reproduction, domestic care, especially, and this is interesting, it's more marked in the upper income groups, middle and upper income groups, not among the poor, okay, not among ordinary workers. But in India, there's a big increase in unpaid labor in the form of domestic duties, and those who are engaged in, collection of fuel, wood, and water for household use, especially water, that's a very big one, and other things like, kitchen gardening, poultry, processing things for family consumption. None of this is called employment. It's not defined as employment. You're called not in the labor force if you do all of these things. And therefore, this actually, again, is unpaid labor that is not even recognized as employment, but it is huge in terms of providing productive inputs into the economy. I want you to step back later, you don't have to think about it right now, and think of what this means for aggregate productivity calculations, GDP per worker estimates, where India is doing really well. And why are we doing so well? Because, yeah, GDP is supposedly rising, but our workforce falling, yeah, relatively, because we're not calling them workers. Okay, finally, pollution, I think I talked about already. When I left Delhi yesterday, the pollution indicator was the maximum, the WHO, there's some API, average pollution index they have, the maximum was 500, and we had reached 484. The small particulate matter 2.5, which is the really lethal one that enters your lungs and kills you and so on, the WHO maximum permissible is 40. We generally live with an average about 200, 300, so we're used to that. But yesterday was 786. Okay, I cannot describe the atmosphere in Delhi yesterday. It was like soup. It was unbelievable. I mean, just stepping out of your house, even inside the house is bad, but stepping out of your house immediately, and there are people who are forced for livelihood to be outside all the time. Okay. China used to be the worst polluted, and of course China and India together we account for, I think, almost 80% of the worst polluted cities in the world. And more than half of the global air pollution related deaths. But note that we are now worse than China. We have more cities there, and our pollution levels in each city are higher than even Beijing. Delhi is now double that of Beijing on average, at a much lower level of development. In other words, we've managed to mess up our environment really fast and at a much lower level of per capita income, which is quite extraordinary, okay? Then, of course, there's water. In China, the big problem, people talk about atmospheric pollution, but the problem really is the water. Desertification is very rapid. It's increasing apace. Beijing, as you know, was always at the edge of a desert, but the desert is advancing gradually, and there are big concerns from the very overambitious projects like Three Gorges, etc., which have created waterlogging and salinity and so on. But water pollution is probably the dominant issue. Most watersheds, lakes, rivers are polluted, both in China and in India. And there's also a massive contamination of underground water sources. Groundwater increasingly polluted because of the large-scale use of chemicals in agriculture and a whole range of other kinds of activities. In China alone, they estimate around 50,000 protests a year about water. 50,000 is a lot, right? I mean, it's how many a day? It's more than 150 a day or something, right? In India, interestingly, we have less protests. It's something we have to figure out why, but water shortages are now acute. And the time spent on water collection, which I mentioned to you earlier, that has gone up. The surveys indicate anything from 4 to 8 hours per day spent by women on just water collection. 4 to 8 hours a day. If you're spending time on that, you obviously are not spending time on a whole range of other activities. And in India, in fact, we have less chemical and more organic and bacterial because we have very poor waste management. And so a lot of the pollution is not necessarily industrial. And I don't have to tell you about the issues with respect to illness, food safety, and all of that. Just to end on a rather depressing note, the left side picture is a picture of rural China, and it is froth generated by water supply. The right side picture is a picture in a lake in Bangalore, Bengaluru city, the home of the software capital of India, right, where everybody thinks it's all full of, Silicon Valley type engineers and so on. This is an urban lake which is so polluted that it periodically erupts in froth. And this happens maybe 7, 8 times a year. The latest one was just a few weeks ago, and it looks like that. Okay, sorry to have depressed you so much. But so what's going on? Finally, and I will stop in a minute. Basically, it's a problem of the growth strategy, the accumulation strategy. You're obsessed with GDP growth. That's the only thing that matters. It doesn't matter about the quality, it doesn't matter about the composition, it doesn't matter about the employment generation. And therefore, you incentivize large capital and you go for these debt cycles in the hope that then all of that trickles down, you know. So, yes, it's a success in GDP terms, but it also generates more inequality, more material insecurity, and worse conditions of life. And ultimately, much more unpleasant social and political responses. You know, when I was a young person, we used to think that, you know, things get really bad and then there will be revolution and socialism and all of that. Now we know that things get really bad and then they get worse because people get really mean and nasty and aggressive. And unfortunately, this is happening also in our countries, both China and India. What do we need instead? We need not a trickle-down. We need what Hyman Minsky called a bubble-up strategy. That is based on good quality employment growth, which will then generate domestic demand and employment and multiplier effects. We need universal provision of public services and reduced reliance on debt cycles. We have to increase consumption not through debt, but through wage incomes. So, public provision of infrastructure, amenities, basic services, the state as the employer of last resort. Okay, that was again a Minskian idea, but it's absolutely relevant in all our countries, I would say also in Europe today. Both regular employment, public services, and the care economy, which is a huge employment generator, massive, massive potential. And casual employment, like in India, the rural employment guarantee. Basically, we have to see wage bills not as a cost, but as a source of effective demand. And that in turn means also that we have to focus not just on large capital and the big enterprises and multinationals, but on micro, small, and medium enterprises in all sectors and create packages for them. And obviously, in that growth, you have to factor in the environmental costs. I've mentioned universal public provision. We used to look at various countries in Europe, but you seem to be looking away from that to further, you know, reduction of that universal public provision, but it plays a huge role macroeconomically. It's not just in terms of reducing the cycles and cushioning that, it's also in terms of generating much more employment and enabling that bubbling up effect. So macroeconomically, wages should increase with productivity. You have to increase productivity of the MSMEs. You all know about the progressive income taxation and redistributive social transfers. You can't do any of this without regulating finance and without controlling the concentration of ownership, not just of land, but a whole range of other resources, including cyberspace. Okay, sorry to have gone on so long, but